Chapter 19. Mr. Newgate's practices give me a desire to learn Polish, but disaster strikes before I can. I was happy when I picked up my last car of coal. The day was near over, and tomorrow was Sunday. Clyde and I were going sledding. Marco and I made it to the weighing station in good time. "You're doing better," said Clayton. He was already there, of course, checking over his deliveries with the supervisor. "The miners aren't going to yell at you so much." He slapped his gloves against his leg to get some of the dust off. Just then the ceiling above us shook a little. Muffled rumbling sounded deep in the mine. "What's that?" I asked. Even the supervisor looked alarmed. He scooted off to the main hallway to take a look. "That's the ceiling of the old corridor," said Clayton. "It's going to collapse before long." The mine boss met up with the supervisor, and the two of them was pointing and talking in hushed tones. Clayton watched him with an angry look on his face. "The Poles are working there," he said. "Oh, it's perfect for the company, ain't it? None of 'em speaks enough English to complain." "I wish I spoke Polish so I could warn 'em," I said. I could see myself whispering to him on my route, then tipping my hat to the mine boss on my way out. "Easy as you please. Maybe I'll learn." "I just hope I'm nowhere near when that collapse finally comes," said Clayton. "Until then, I'm watching the rats." The sledding weren't too good the next day. The snow was old and thin, so it was slow going down the hill. Mostly Clyde and I spent our time roaming through town looking for icicles. They hung from the rafters of different buildings here and there, fierce and angry looking. Some were nearly 2 feet long. We took turns keeping each other steady as one climbed atop a fence post to wrench him free. When each of us had an armful, we walked down to the tracks and threw them like spears. Our eyes trailed them till we saw a tiny explosion of shattered ice in the distance. When the icicles were gone, we ran up to see what we'd done. About 1,000,000 pieces of ice were flung around the tracks, all sharp and glittery like broken glass. Some had sunk through the snow, and others had landed right on top of the tracks. I guess they stayed there till next train came and melted them away in an instant. I threw those icicles so hard that my shoulder was sore the next day. I couldn't lift the sack of lime to sprinkle over the straw in Markle's stall without groaning. "What's wrong with you?" asked Clayton. I think I threw my arm out. Clyde and I were throwing icicles all day. "Well, heck, Billy," he said. "You gotta have more sense. You're a working man now." He took the sack from me and started spreading it around. Suddenly a rumbling echoed deep in the mountain, only this time it was so strong that the floor beneath us started rocking. It grew louder and louder till the whole mine was filled with the sound of boulders and rubble crashing against each other. "Brace yourself, Billy. The old corridor's coming down," yelled Clayton. But the floor was pitching too hard for me, and I was knocked to the ground. Clayton was next, and he tumbled on top of me, pinning me so hard against the wall that I couldn't breathe for a bit. That's when I started getting panicky, because I couldn't tell if it was him or a mound of rubble burying me. Somehow he righted himself. Then he picked me up and started yelling at me to get up and keep standing no matter what. "Keep your head up, Billy, your shoulders too, so we can dig our way out if we have to." Bits of rock and debris flew through the corridor into my eyes and throat, and I started coughing something fierce. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the shaking stopped, and even though we could hear the sound of boulders and timbers crashing elsewhere, our end of the mine was still. Coal dust hung in the air like smoke. I grabbed Markle's reins and was all set to go, but Clayton made me leave him behind. "Don't bother, Millie. Mr. Newgate'll buy a new mule, but he won't pay for our funerals. Come on now, someone's lamp is going to ignite all the coal dust in the air and the whole mine will explode." An alarm whistle pierced the stillness, which struck me as odd and funny in a way, considering that it was after the fact. What we really needed was an alarm that went off before a collapse, but I guess Mr. Newgate hadn't thought of that. Miners were streaming through the corridor. Some were panicking and pushing their way to the entrance. Others were walking calm as could be with their picks and shovels and lunch pails, just like it was quitting time of any other day. A few were bleeding from where a rock or falling timber had grazed them, and one miner was dragging a crushed foot while 2 of his buddies helped him out. Seeing him made me think of Uncle Jim and Clyde, and I ran into the crowd of miners, dodging the ones who were running by me and pushing past the slower ones. All of them looked alike with their blackened clothes and faces, so I searched the crowd for one who was a head shorter than most, and then an even shorter one with blonde hair sticking out of his cap. In a flash, Clayton was after me, yanking me by my collar and yelling, "You can't go back there." I tried squirming out of his grasp, but he was too strong for me. "I've got to find my uncle and Clyde." "Can't, Billy. It's too dangerous. Come on now, they might be out already." He threw an arm around me and near dragged me back a few steps. More and more folks rushed past us now, and I could hear some men yelling near the entrance to the old section. They called for the fire crew to get in there quick, and I could tell that there was nothing any of us could do unless we was part of a rescue team. So I gave up trying and ran into daylight with Clayton. Already the mine boss had ordered the entrance to the mine to be fenced off so that the families of the miners trapped inside wouldn't go crazy with fear and grief and run in to find their kid. The rest of us was pushed away while a crew of men stretched out a length of chain link. Everyone was looking for their family and friends, and the same questions kept being asked over and over. Where were you when it happened? Who else was with you? Did you see old Pete or any of the Poles? Did anyone in the old corridor make it out, or are all of them buried under the rubble? Seemed like we broke up by nationalities, with the Italian miners at one end, the Welshmen at the other, and the colored and the Russian, Romanian, and native-born in between. None of the Polish miners was there. After Clayton found his mother, he walked me over to the Welshman to wait for Uncle Jim. Mr. Moon was there talking to the others. "Don't worry about your father," said Mr. Moon. "He was working the face farthest from the old corridor. He'll be limping out soon enough." Little Frank Moon lit up when he saw me. He broke away from his paw to grab hold of my wrist and begged me for a story about Walter Barnes. "Not now," I told him, but he didn't let up on me till I had to push him away. What the heck did he think was going on, I wondered. I kept my eyes on the slow trickle of men coming out of the mine. Finally, a small man with a stream of blood down the side of his face hobbled out slowly. It was Uncle Jim. I ran over to him and he pulled us close, saying, "Bless you, lad, bless you. Thank God you're safe." "What happened to you?" The blood was running bright and red down his pants now. "Nothing your aunt can't stitch up for me. One of the rocks flying through caught my forehead. How are you, lad? Where were you when it happened?" "I was in the stables. Clayton here helped me out." "Oh, thank you, Clayton, thank you." He shook Clayton's hand, bloody and all. Then he asked, "What about Clyde? Where was he today?" "He was working the trap near the old tunnel," I answered. Even behind the bloodstains and the coal on his face, I could see Uncle Jim's expression fall. A sense of dread fell over me, and I suddenly felt weary, like my bones was collapsing. Somehow in that second I knew Clyde was dead. Uncle Jim must have read my thoughts, for he did his best to recover himself. "Let's not worry yet, lad. We'll ask around to see if anyone has seen him." By now women and children were running up from the village looking for their men. Aunt Agnes was first among them, carrying her doctor's bag. Her face was set in a grim expression, but she sighed with relief when she saw us. She didn't say a word, just buried her head in Uncle Jim's shoulder and pulled me into the two of them. "Well now, what have you done to yourself?" she said once she broke away and got a look at Uncle Jim. She cleaned his wound and stitched it up. Then she was off to tend to anyone else who needed her. It was near dark, and the rescuers were still digging through the rubble. They brought out the dead on planks of wood and set up a little morgue right on the snow. Clyde's mother was there too, but I couldn't bear to look at her. She was stricken with worry, and I kept my eyes down whenever she was near. There were too many folks for Belton, so he was up in the mountain watching and hiding. I caught sight of him darting from one tree to another. For some reason he warn't wearing coat or shoes. He was just a thin white figure in the bare trees, and it made me think of Meek Jones disappearing into the woods the night he drowned. An hour went by, maybe more, but in the end the rescue workers brought out poor Clyde on a plank of wood. His body was whole, but one side of his head was crushed. Mrs. Light fell to her knees in the snow. Belton came running, but the rescuers wouldn't let him near. It made me angry when folks said Belton didn't have no sense. He knew his brother was dead.